And today, we're plunging into a source one of you recommended, Stephen Clarke's 1,000 Years of Annoying the French.
Exactly. And it's a seriously funny look at why the English and later the British and the French have spent like the last millennium just getting under each other's skin. History, but with friction, you know?
Yeah, Clarke's whole argument is that this mutual annoyance, let's call it, is this constant thread through their past. So our job today is to pull out the key moments, maybe some surprising facts, maybe a few laughs along the way.
Right. We want to understand the main ways they've irritated each other historically and maybe what that actually tells us about them.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's get straight into it. Starting with what Clarke calls the original annoyance, the Norman Conquest, 1066.
Right, so you've got Robert the Magnificent, Duke of Normandy, and his son William. Now, William was illegitimate, which probably meant he had to be extra ambitious.
Guillaume to the French.
Guillaume, yes. Though Clarke points out, his name was basically the English William anyway. Even the Bayeux Tapestry, that amazing visual record, though probably biased towards the Normans, calls him Willem. Sounds quite Northern European, actually.
And Clarke makes this point that William was almost like set up to be a conqueror from day one.
How so?
Well, his dad, Robert, never married William's mother, but he still declared William his heir way back in 1035. Imagine that. An illegitimate son inheriting a major dukedom.
Huh. That's unusual.
Totally. A French historian apparently called it unheard of in Christian Europe at the time.
So that beginning plus Clarke describing him as just intensely determined to get his way and build a dynasty.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see how that sets the stage for, well, annoying England.
And the Bayeux Tapestry itself. It's huge, isn't it? Like 70 meters long.
Incredible piece of work. Like a medieval comic strip, telling the story leading up to the invasion.
Clarke calls it a miracle it survived. Apparently, it almost became wagon covers during the French Revolution. And Goebbels tried to grab it in World War II.
Wow. Close calls. But the story it tells. About Edward the Confessor dying, Harold grabbing the throne, and William's excuse for invading. That's key.
The oath, right.
Exactly. The Normans claimed Harold had sworn this super serious oath to William, supposedly on holy relics, promising him the English crown.
So when the English council, the Witenagemot,
Their assembly of wise men, yeah.
when they chose Harold instead, the Normans just cried foul immediately.
Absolutely. Breaking an oath back then in the feudal system, that was like the ultimate crime. Treason, betrayal, all rolled into one.
So William, feeling totally justified in his mind, launches the invasion. Battle of Hastings, October 1066.
And wins. Clarke, with that typical English humor, maybe suggests they only won because Harold's army was knackered from fighting off Norwegians just before.
Always an excuse, isn't there? Slightly amused. It's a bit of a pattern, maybe. But yeah, the Norman victory was decisive. And William's actions straight after, pretty brutal.
Like what?
Started with a massacre down in Romney. Apparently one of his ships went off course. The crew got killed by locals, so William took revenge. Then he looted Winchester, the old Anglo-Saxon capital.
Symbolic.
Very. And then Edgar the Atheling, the young Anglo-Saxon claimant, surrendered at Berkhamsted. But William wanted London, had to be crowned there.
Right. And then comes the really nasty part. Clarke talks about something that sounds like a proper war crime.
Yeah, the harrying of the North. William was furious about ongoing resistance up there, so he basically ordered his army to destroy everything. Huge area of northern England, Lancaster to York, burned crops, killed livestock, slaughtered people.
Just scorched earth.
Totally devastating. Contemporary writers said people were starving in the woods, hiding from the Normans. The whole region was apparently pretty much deserted for decades afterwards. Okay, so the Normans are in charge. Brutally, it seems. But how does this initial conquest set up centuries of the English annoying the French?
Well, one big way is language. Over time, you get this merging. Anglo-Saxon, the language of the locals, and Norman French, the language of the rulers. They start to blend.
Creating early English.
Exactly. And this new English language became, well, more flexible. Less rigid grammar than French. Clarke jokes that anyone who's ever battled with French verb conjugations can appreciate the freedom of English.
I can relate to that. So how did the actual French back in France view this linguistic mashup?
Not very favorably, as you can imagine. French grammarians often looked down their noses at English, called it an impure bastard language.
Ouch.
Yeah. And the irony, as Clarke points out, is that this bastard language owes its very existence to William the Conqueror, a Norman bastard born on French soil. So right from the get-go, you have this kind of linguistic snobbery, a seed of annoyance planted early on.
Okay, so the Normans are running England, but they're still culturally quite French initially. How do the English kings start developing their own tradition of, well, French bashing?
It's gradual. I mean, for a long time, the English kings still held big chunks of France and had loads of French connections.
Mhm.
But you start seeing cracks.
Like with Henry II?
Yeah. Take his son, young Henry.
Hmm.
He rebelled against his dad in 1173. And who supported him? His mum, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and the French king Louis VII.
Who was Eleanor's ex-husband? Bit awkward.
Very.
Yeah.
So you've got family drama mixing with politics, classic medieval stuff.
And then Richard the Lionheart, legendary English king, who didn't actually like England much, did he?
Not really, no. He was far more interested in his lands in France and going on crusade. There's that famous quote about him saying he'd have sold London if he could have found a buyer just to fund his wars.
Doesn't sound very patriotic.
Not towards England, anyway.
Which brings us to his brother, King John, the bad guy from Robin Hood. Always plotting. But his French bashing seems more like a failure, right?
Pretty much, yeah. John definitely kept up the family tradition of scheming. But his military record in France was not great. He got hammered at La Roche-Amoun and Bouvines in 1214.
Lost Normandy and Brittany.
Huge losses. Clarke suggests John learned the hard way, that once you've annoyed a Frenchman, maybe don't give them another chance to get revenge. He just kept poking the bear.
So John dies in 1216. And then there's this interesting moment where the English barons ditch the invading French Prince Louis and back John's young son, Henry III, instead. Why?
Well, several reasons, probably. A 9-year-old king like Henry III was likely easier for the barons to control, keep their own power.
Makes sense.
But it also signals a shift. These powerful English lords, who maybe still thought of themselves as Normans living abroad, started to realize their future was in England. Their roots were there now.
So choosing Henry III was kind of like choosing England over France.
In a way, yes. Clarke argues it further distanced England from France and really helped build this sense of a separate English identity. Less Norman, more English.
Okay, let's jump forward a bit. The 100 Years' War. Clarke calls it a huge mistake and points out it lasted 116 years, more than just a mathematical error.
He's got away with words. And yeah, the French Wikipedia summary is apparently just French victory, which, as Clarke says, kind of ignores the massive suffering involved, mostly on French soil.
So why did the English keep this massive annoyance going for so long? Clarke's answer is pretty blunt. Because they could.
Basically, yeah. Geopolitics. Their neighbors to the east, the Flemish, were allies. Scotland and Wales. Difficult to conquer, not that rich. But France. France was rich, relatively easy to get to, and often politically divided. Ripe for the picking, or at least ripe for annoying.
Enter Edward III. New English king. Had a bit of a rough start in life, didn't he? Clarke mentions his dad was likely murdered, maybe with his mum involved.
Yeah, quite the backstory. Probably made him pretty determined, maybe ruthless. He needed money from Parliament, got it through taxes, and then decided to take the fight to France, starting with a big naval win in 1340.
And then comes the big one, Crécy, 1346. Clarke visited the site and mentions the plaque there.
Oh yeah, the plaque that sounds quintessentially French, listing excuses. The sun was in their eyes, the cavalry was tired. But the English archers were conveniently refreshed.
Chuckles, always blame the weather. Or fatigue.
But Crécy was a massive disaster for the French. And it was mostly down to the English longbows.
Devastatingly effective.
Hugely. Firing maybe 10 arrows a minute. You've got 7,000 English archers. Clarke estimates in the first minute alone, something like 70,000 arrows raining down.
Terrifying.
And the French tactics, Clarke calls them a joke. Edward III positioned his smaller army cleverly on a slope, protected ground, the French. Just a massive traffic jam of knights trying to charge uphill.
Right. Logistical nightmare for them. There's also that incredible story of the blind King John of Bohemia fighting for the French. Insisted on charging in, tied his horse's reins to his knights. Brave, but futile.
After Crécy, Edward III besieges Calais. And initially he wants to execute the town leaders, the burghers, for resisting.
Yeah.
What changed his mind? Accounts vary. Maybe his pregnant wife, Queen Philippa, pleaded for them. Maybe a savvy advisor warned him it would set a bad precedent for his own captured knights.
So he spared them.
He did. But he kicked out the rich citizens and replaced them with Englishmen. Made Calais an English town on French soil. Clarke is a bit cynical about the heroism of the famous burghers of Calais statue, suggesting they only offered themselves up after trying to sacrifice the poor folk first.
Always a catch. And then the Black Death hits in the mid-14th century. Obviously horrific, but Clarke says it actually helped the English annoy the French even more, indirectly.
Yeah, it's an unexpected consequence. The plague killed so many people across Europe, including England. This created a massive labor shortage.
So surviving peasants had more power.
Exactly. They could demand better wages, move around for work. And as these Anglo-Saxon lower classes gained influence and mobility, their language, that English blend, spread even further. It weakened the grip of Norman French within England itself. Another step towards a distinct English identity and language.
Okay, let's leap ahead again. Henry V, Agincourt, 1415. Another legendary English victory, another massive annoyance for the French.
Right. Clarke notes the Hundred Years' War was kind of dragging on by then, kept alive partly because English soldiers found it profitable. Henry's predecessor, Richard II, had actually tried to make peace with France.
Which didn't go down well back home.
Not at all. Made him really unpopular. So Henry V comes in, restarts the aggression, reasserts the English claim to the French throne. Profit was definitely a motive.
And Agincourt itself. Famously outnumbered English army facing a super confident French force.
Hugely outnumbered, yeah. Shakespeare exaggerated the numbers, but the French definitely had the advantage on paper.
But the English used those Crecy tactics again.
Pretty much. Longbows, defensive positions, sharpened stakes driven into the ground to stop cavalry charges, and the French cavalry got bogged down in the mud. It was another archer-led victory.
But then there's the controversial bit. Henry ordering the killing of French prisoners. That's still a sore point in France, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. It was seen as barbaric, even then, going against the rules of chivalry, killing unarmed prisoners mid-battle because he feared they might rejoin the fight. Clarke, maybe a bit provocatively, contrasts this with France's own later enthusiasm for mass executions during the Revolution, but still, it was a dark moment.
Henry V wins, but dies young, and his baby son becomes king of both England and France. That sounds unstable.
Very unstable. Very short-lived, that dual monarchy. The English hold on France was always pretty shaky.
Which leads us perfectly to Joan of Arc. Clarke's chapter title is A Martyr to French Propaganda. That's strong.
It is. His argument is basically, yes, the English burned her at the stake, no question, but the people who actually engineered her trial, condemned her, and handed her over, they were mostly French collaborators, Burgundians allied with the English.
So he's saying the French have kind of conveniently forgotten their part in it?
That's his angle, that for centuries, the French narrative has blamed the English entirely, focusing on the slightly bizarre official reason for her execution wearing men's clothes rather than the complex politics and French involvement.
Makes you think. Okay, so after Joan, the English eventually lose most of France, but they hang on to Calais for ages.
Yeah.
Another constant irritation right on France's doorstep.
For centuries, yeah. Calais was super important economically for England, controlled the wool trade, brought in loads of cash. Clarke mentions they had really strict rules there. Gates locked at noon and 4 p.m., daily mass specifically celebrating England's ability to, well, annoy France.
They really leaned into it, and then there's that amazing spectacle, the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520, Henry VIII versus Francois I. Clarke calls it bling with a sting. What was the sting?
Beyond the insane extravagance, gold tents, fountains flowing with wine, weeks of jousting, the real point, according to Clarke, was for Henry VIII to basically bankrupt Francois I.
A diplomatic spending war.
Exactly. Forced the French king to borrow so much money keeping up appearances that he couldn't afford to try and retake Calais or cause other trouble. Smart, if cynical.
But the French did eventually get Calais back in 1558, and Clarke tells this almost unbelievable story about beer.
Chuckles. It sounds crazy, but yes.
Ugh.
The story goes that when the French launched a surprise winter attack, the English deputy governor hesitated to flood the defensive marshes around the town. Why? Because it would ruin the local water supply needed for brewing good English beer.
No. Seriously.
That's the tale. Apparently, prioritizing ale quality over defense proved fatal. The French attacked across the frozen marshes, fulfilling some old prophecy about iron guns swimming, and took the town. A very English way to lose, perhaps.
Unbelievable. Okay, moving on. Mary, Queen of Scots. Strong French connections, obviously. Her execution in 1587 was basically the end of any serious French claim to the English throne through her line.
Right. And Mary herself, Clarke says, saw her death entirely through that lens. Her last letter to the French king basically said, "I'm being killed because I'm a French threat to Elizabeth."
But her son, James, King of Scotland, later England, he wasn't too bothered.
Seemed remarkably indifferent, according to Clarke. More concerned about securing his own position as the undisputed heir to the English throne. Pragmatic, maybe, but cold.
Now, let's shift focus a bit. French colonial efforts. Clarke titles this section, France Gets Lost in Paradise, focusing on how often they lost out to the English, especially in North America and India. He even starts with a little dig at how Parisians view Quebecois French.
Smiling. Yeah, apparently the perception in France is that Quebecois sounds a bit old-fashioned, maybe needs subtitles sometimes, a sort of linguistic snobbery again.
And their actual colonies, it feels like a catalog of almosts and if-onlys. Verrazano claimed huge swaths of North America, but nothing much came of it. Huguenot attempts in the Carolinas failed due to religious wars back home and English meddling.
Then you have Acadie, modern Nova Scotia. Constant tension, eventually leading to the British forcibly deporting the French-speaking Acadians, the Grand Arrangement.
And Quebec itself lost to Wolfe on the Plains of Abraham. It seems like wherever the French tried to build an empire, the English were there to annoy them out of it.
It was a recurring theme. Significant setbacks. Clarke also touches on Charles II of England's time in France during his exile. He learned the fancy French manners, but ultimately saw Louis XIV was just using him.
Even champagne, surely that's purely French.
Well, it became hugely popular in England first, apparently thanks to a French exile, Saint Evremont. But the French have always been fiercely protective of the name champagne. Clarke notes they even got a clause in the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, specifically banning anyone else from using the name. Still annoying people about it.
Louis XIV, the Sun King, seems like the ultimate target for annoyance, all that power, Versailles.
Oh, absolutely. His absolute rule, the sheer arrogance, the incredibly controlled, almost stifling life at Versailles, it was all ripe for criticism, especially from the English.
And people did resist him. William of Orange flooding the Netherlands.
Right. And Louis XIV, through his actions, basically created his own worst enemies in the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy. They handed him some major defeats, like the Battle of Blenheim.
And Louis himself apparently regretted his warmongering at the end.
So the story goes, on his deathbed, admitting he loved war too much and impoverished France, recognizing the long-term damage his constant need for glory, often against the English and their allies, had caused.
The Enlightenment period follows. Interesting shifts there. Voltaire, the great French writer, was actually a huge Anglophile, wasn't he?
He really was. He spent time in England and hugely admired their political system, their relative freedoms, their scientific thought. His writings praising England had a big impact back in France, feeding into the intellectual currents that would eventually lead to their own revolution.
But the rivalry continued. The 7 Years' War. Basically World War Zero.
Pretty much. A global conflict, largely driven by the Anglo-French competition for empire, fought in Europe, North America, India, everywhere. More annoyance on a grander scale.
Then comes the American Revolution. Here, France gets a chance to annoy Britain back, right? By supporting the colonists.
Absolutely. Their primary motivation, according to Clarke, was payback for the 7 Years' War, sticking it to the British. Benjamin Franklin became this massive celebrity in Paris, the embodiment of American virtue.
But it cost them dearly, didn't it?
Hugely. Turgot, the finance minister, warned the king it would bankrupt France. And he wasn't far wrong. The cost of supporting the American Revolution piled onto France's existing debts and was a major factor leading to their own financial crisis and revolution just a few years later.
And speaking of America, there's the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon's selling off this vast territory.
Strategic move by Napoleon. He needed cash for his wars in Europe, and he figured selling it to the Americans was better than risking the British eventually taking it. Annoying Britain by proxy, perhaps.
Meanwhile, in India and the Pacific, more French setbacks against the English East India Company, and awkward encounters in Tahiti between Bougainville and Captain Cook.
Yes, the competing accounts of paradise, slightly tainted by arguments over who introduced European diseases, a less glorious side to exploration.
Now, this one surprised me. The guillotine, that symbol of the French Revolution. Clarke argues it wasn't really a French invention.
He makes a strong case. Dr. Guillotine advocated for a more humane, efficient execution method, yes, but he was inspired by machines already existing elsewhere, including the Halifax gibbet in England and similar devices in Scotland and Italy.
So he just proposed adopting something similar.
Pretty much. The public initially mocked the idea, and ironically, they nicknamed the proposed machine Guillotine after him. Apparently, Dr. Guillotine was horrified his name became attached to it.
And then it became the symbol of the terror.
The grimly efficient tool of revolutionary justice, yeah.
Okay, the French Revolution itself. Clarke's take involves eating cake and each other, partly fueled by British influence. Sounds chaotic.
It was incredibly chaotic. He argues the financial crisis was partly down to all those wars with Britain and funding the Americans. Then the Bastille falls. Louis VI dithers over becoming a constitutional monarch. Rumors spread like wildfire, including the Great Fear, where peasants panicked about non-existent English invasion forces supposedly hired by aristocrats.
So Britain was a factor, even if indirectly.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And many French aristocrats fled to England, the émigrés. The British were sympathetic, but also, Clarke suggests, saw opportunities to maybe exploit the situation.
And the let them eat take line from Marie Antoinette.
Almost certainly a myth, Clarke says. Probably propaganda attributed to her much later. They even tried to invent a whole new calendar, which nobody liked. Oh, and there's a bizarre failed French invasion of Wales near Fishguard, easily repelled by local militias, including women apparently.
A forgotten footnote of annoyance. And out of all this chaos rises Napoleon. Clarke cheekily calls him possibly a British product.
In the sense that the revolution, which Britain certainly influenced and reacted to, created the conditions for his rise. His story is just incredible, isn't it? Early success at Toulon, his relationship with Josephine, turning a ragged army in Italy into conquerors.
But always obsessed with Britain, Nelson beating him at the Battle of the Nile.
Huge blow, cutting off his ambitions in Egypt. Back home, Napoleon brought order with things like the Code Civil, great legal reform, though Clarke points out it actually rolled back rights for women.
Then the brief peace with Britain-Amiens didn't last long.
Nope. Soon planning invasions again. Even ideas for a channel tunnel back then. He marries an Austrian princess, Marie-Louise, for legitimacy, gets defeated, exiled to Elba, comes back.
The 100 Days, Waterloo.
The final showdown. Clarke notes how both Napoleon and Wellington kind of underestimated each other. Wellington used his classic defensive tactics brilliantly, and the weather played a part. Too heavy rain delaying Napoleon's attack.
And that was that. But Napoleon's legacy isn't just war, is it?
No, absolutely not. That Egyptian expedition, though a military failure against the British, led to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Massive contribution to understanding ancient history.
And even things like the baguette, post-revolutionary invention.
Apparently so, linked to new baking laws. Though the croissant, that other French icon, Clarke points out its origins are actually Austrian, introduced to Paris later. Still delicious, though.
After Napoleon, the annoyances continued, just maybe less dramatically. Romantic literature challenging French classical styles.
Yeah, different kinds of friction. You get the July Revolution in 1830, bringing in Louis Philippe, the citizen king. Initially seemed more liberal. Queen Victoria even visited, fostering that early idea of an entente cordiale, a friendly understanding.
But Louis Philippe ended up overthrown too, right? And fled to England.
Of course. Ended his days in Surrey with surprising British sympathy, Clarke notes, even some quiet financial help. Then his nephew, Napoleon III, has his own reign, ends up losing the Franco-Prussian War, losing Alsace-Lorraine to Germany, and also dies bizarrely in England after surgery.
There's a pattern here.
Definitely. Meanwhile, France suffers the phylloxera blight, devastating vineyards. But then you get Prince Bertie, Queen Victoria's son, later Edward VII. He absolutely loved Paris.
Keeping a bit of a star there.
Totally. Helps smooth things over considerably. Then comes the Belle Époque, that era of glamour and perhaps decadence before World War I. Clarke mentions places like Le Chabanais, a famous high-class Parisian brothel frequented by royalty, including Bertie.
Which brings us to the formal Entente Cordiale in 1904. A proper agreement to, maybe, stop annoying each other quite so much.
At least publicly. And Edward VII, the Bertie, was absolutely central to it. His diplomatic skills, his genuine affection for Paris, his charm offensive there really worked. It thawed relations significantly.
So after centuries of fighting and sniping, they finally buried the hatchet.
It paved the way for cooperation. Just in time for World War I. Despite initial French setbacks, you had moments like the Miracle of the Marne, where Parisian taxis ferried troops to the front. Real alliance. British troops fighting alongside the French. Maurois, the French writer, even wrote sympathetically about British officers. And back to Champagne, the Treaty of Versailles formally protected its name.
But then, World War II, Clarke's advice, don't mention Dunkirk or Mers el-Kabir. Sounds like old wounds reopened.
Oh, big time. The narratives of the war are often starkly different. From a French perspective, there's often less focus on the initial collapse and more on the resistance and the eventual liberation of Paris by Leclerc's Free French forces.
Whereas the British...
I remember Chamberlain appeasing Hitler at Munich, largely excluding France. Then Churchill's famous Dunkirk speech, focusing on the British evacuation, understandable, but grating for the French troops left behind are also evacuated. And Mers el-Kabir, the British, destroying a large part of the French fleet to stop it falling into German hands. That was seen as a terrible betrayal by many in France. Still sensitive.
And de Gaulle, His relationship with Churchill and Roosevelt wasn't easy, was it?
Very prickly. He felt constantly sidelined, excluded from major decisions like the North Africa landings. There was the disastrous Anglo-free French raid on Dakar. Operation Frankton, the Cockleshell Heroes raid, ended badly, partly due to betrayal by French informants, according to Clarke. It was fraught.
And life under occupation. Clarke touches on the intellectuals like Sartre, the collaborators like Coco Chanel.
Complex picture. Reprisals against women accused of collaboration horizontal after the war, the strange situation of the occupied Channel Islands British territory under German rule, Allied troops getting instructions on how not to annoy the French when they arrived for liberation. It was all incredibly complicated. Then post-war struggles like Indochina, Dien Bien Phu, and French cinema's new wave reacting against Hollywood dominance. Always that push-pull.
So after de Gaulle, Clarke reckons it was kind of back to annoying each other, but in a more modern EU-type way.
Yeah, the rivalry just mutated. Britain finally joins the European community, de Gaulle having vetoed it twice. Then you get surges of Francophobia in the British press, especially around things like the Falklands War, kick 'em in the Gauls, that sort of thing.
The infamous beef wars over mad cow disease, Chirac's alleged comments about British food.
Exactly. The Channel, plagued by delays, budget rose, arguments over naming the London terminal Waterloo. France passed the Two-Bon Law, trying to protect the French language from English TWFRLDRNGLISH words, largely ignored. Remember freedom fries in the U.S. Congress?
Oh, yeah.
Even Sarkozy's state visit to the UK had underlying historical tensions. And the fuss when the Queen wasn't initially invited to the 65th D-Day anniversary in Normandy. Clarke wraps up with some great historical quotes. Louis XVI, Stern, Walpole, basically saying this mutual suspicion goes way, way back. Some things, it seems, are hard to shake off.
So after wading through 1,000 years of this friction, what's the main takeaway for you?
I think it's just how incredibly intertwined these two nations are, for all the conflict and the annoyance. They've profoundly shaped each other. It's this really complex tapestry war, alliance, rivalry, imitation, irritation. You can't understand one without understanding its relationship with the other.
Yeah, definitely. For me, the detail that sticks out is probably that Calais beer story. Losing a strategic town because you're worried about the brewing water. It's just perfectly, absurdly specific. Or maybe the fact, let them eat cake, was likely just propaganda. History's full of those odd details.
Those little anecdotes really bring the whole messy, fascinating relationship to life, don't they?
Absolutely. So maybe a final thought for you listening. After hearing about this millennium of bickering, rivalry, occasional alliances, and constant mutual fascination, is this annoyance just baked into the Anglo-French relationship forever? Is it inevitable? Or could you imagine a future that's genuinely, truly cordial? And what on earth would that actually take?
Something to ponder, perhaps. Maybe after reading Clarke's book for yourself.
Definitely something to think about.